Faraway Wanderers, is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 37. Circus. In those 10 years, in which he had been living as neither man nor ghost, his heart was iron and stone, never once uncertain, and never once panicked. Shouldering the responsibility of the Four Seasons Manor as a child of 15, meeting the Crown Prince Helianyi by chance, which sparked his youthful heroism at 18, establishing Tianchuang single-handedly at 23, all that he should have done, he had completed. Even if his name could not be recorded in the annals, the mountains and the rivers of this nation were monuments of his contributions. As Josishu said this, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, making it seem even more like a grimace. But the gaze he cast over on them was like the sweep of a frosty beam of light. In that instant, Huang Daoren hesitated in his steps, and an urge to retreat suddenly surfaced in his heart. But after glimpsing Youku in the comber of his eye, he had no choice but to stand firm. Huang Daoren had always felt that Youku and his dead son were superficial pretty faces. They were useless at everything, and could only rely on their sect, which was steadily waning by the day, to sufficiently maintain appearances to squeeze themselves into being included amongst the few major sects. Kangsan sect had always had good relations with Huashan sect all along, and Huang Daoren felt that he was helping these pretty but useless faces out in all aspects on behalf of their sect ties. For one, he could brag about how honorable he was, and for another, he pitied Youku. In front of such a pitiful and cowardly man, how could Huang Daoren retreat? He silently drew an evaluation of the large crowd behind him, and was instantly assured, thinking, there are so many of us, even if each one of us only stamped on Yan once, it's enough to eat new info noodles. And thus he shouted with great vigor, what's there to talk to him about? We'll know once we arrest and interrogate him. His voice was an explosion right by Youku ear. Frowning lightly, Youku distractedly fanned himself a few times with that landscape illustrated fan, his face tilted slightly to the side. He was thoroughly annoyed by having to team up with cads like Huang Daoren, feeling that other than his plain looks, his actions and manner was more like a village hooligan's. Even the pig slaughtering, meat dicing butcher at the market was more refined than he was. Not only was Huang Daoren simple-minded, but he also still liked to run about, with villages within 10 to able to hear his voice once he opened his mouth, as if he was afraid that no one knew he was there. Youku regarded Josishu with a frosty smile and didn't pick up where Huang Daoren had left off, thinking that if it weren't for the weakening might of the Huashan sect in these recent years, and that he was worried that it would be difficult for them to succeed without support, how would he be willing to claim brotherhood with this sort of slimy person? If this dumbass was willing to take the charge, he would let him. It was just as well that these two people were of unknown background and undetermined expertise, and no one knew what kind of attitude the descendant of the ancient monk held. He would use Huang Daoren to test the waters. And thus something awkward happened. Huang Daoren's intention was for Youku to pick up from where he had left off once he was done shouting, and have the crowd behind him swarm all at once thereafter, so he would not have to put in any effort and could still wait smugly off to one side. Yet, he had not expected Youku to remain silent, waiting for him to charge ahead into danger. Unclear of the situation, the crowd behind Huang Daoren only stared at him, and no one moved a single step. Tens of people clogged the narrow alleyway, but in that instant, not one person spoke up, leaving the alley in pin-drop silence. In half a lifetime's worth of existence, Wenbuxing had never witnessed such a bizarre sight. He had always been the sort to laugh when he wanted, cry when he desired, and play the ruffian when he felt like it, not bothering to be polite. He cackled uproariously, pointing at Huang Daoren as he booed. "I say, don't tell me that the few of you didn't rehearse this properly and have forgotten your lines. Get off the stage. How is it that you dare come perform the opera when you haven't even familiarized yourself with the steps? You won't earn any tips from anyone." After observing the situation for half a beat, Ye Bai said, "What is this nonsense?" and turned to leave, neglecting Lu Qianqiao. In a flash, there was no trace of his white figure. Thinking this entire encounter a circus, Josicel 1 did not feel like entertaining these people any longer. He made to leave, but Huang Daoren gave a strange shout of, "Kid, don't think you can go," and pounced. Josishu's figure straightened all of a sudden, and without looking back, he ordered, "Get lost." A whirl of his long sleeve birthed 2 gusts of force. With great accuracy, one hit Huang Daoren in the shoulder, the other on his knee, and Huang Daoren was really as well behaved as a little child, rolling away obediently. Wenbuxing was laughing so hard that he had to support himself with the wall, unable to stand straight. It was his first time discovering that this Josu was not only likable, but also had a sense of mischief that he did not realize he himself possessed, and this was too interesting. But tragedy struck before he was done laughing. While everyone's attention was focused on Zhou's issue, Yukayufeng suddenly caused trouble. His long sword whistled as it left the scabbard, thrust towards Wenbuxing's neck without warning. Even though each word of his earlier was aimed at Zhou's issue as if he had not seen Wenbuxing at all, he had actually been secretly taking note of him. Even if Wenbuxing had turned into ashes, the elegant Huashan sect leader would still remember that it was he who had made him tumble so disgracefully in front of so many onlookers. If he didn't get revenge for this, Yukayufeng felt that he was disgracing his own identity as a man. Of course, this was pure overthinking on sect leader Yu's part, because even if he had gotten revenge, not even a fool on this earth would treat him as a man. Wenbuxing slapped his palm on the wall and bent backwards, near horizontally, to dodge the blow. Determined, Yukayufeng's sword arrived yet again in a array of strokes, each more vicious than the last. Wenbuxing was even more baffled. That day, he had really downed a lot of wine, and had been completely sloshed, unable to recall what year or day it had been. He had long forgotten about that trivial misunderstanding with sect leader Yu, and even if he had remembered, he would probably not think much of it. Yukayufeng wasn't a prissy young maiden that needed to preserve her own beauty and face. If he tumbled, so be it. What was the big deal? So he had entirely no clue how he, an innocent passerby, had offended the sect leader Yu. Looking at his opponent's attacks, it was as if he had snatched his wife. Wenbuxing felt very wronged, because men, in general, did not have male wives. He didn't retaliate, retreating without rest, saying, "Say, what do you mean by this?" Yukayufeng gave a cold chuckle. "Those of unorthodox paths are of abominable evil. The masses demand for them to be clobbered. It is fruitless to explain this, die." Wenbuxing tilted his face to the side, avoiding the single thrust, and stuck out 2 engers with accuracy, trapping Yukayufeng's sword in between them. He scoffed, "Demand for them to be clobbered? My apologies, I'm not a rat, and I'm begging you to do this kind deed. Don't come after me bearing deep grudges like your rat poison." He made a soft noise of exertion, and Yukayufeng's sword snapped in his hand. In the pugilist world, among the greatest ways one could humiliate someone else, shattering someone's weapon ranked right behind killing someone's father and snatching their wife. Yukayufeng's eyes reddened. He drove a palm towards Wenbuxing's chest right as he leapt to send a kick at his crotch, his movements swift like he had honed each strike through intense practice. Thankfully, after Huang Daoren had rolled away, the crowd behind him that seemed to be enjoying the show now realized that they should be eradicating evil and went to pester Zhou Zishu. No one noticed that in this overlooked Comer, the Huashan sect leader was putting up a performance of the teasing and kick in front of the crowd. Strange events occurred every year, but there were particularly many of them this year. Leaning sideways, Wenbuxing raised his knee and landed it right on Youku thigh. Instantly, a crack could be heard as the bone fractured. Simultaneously, his palm collided head-on with his. Youku only felt a torrential wave of internal energy surging at him with the palm, but it was already too late. His own palm seemed to be pulled towards his opponent's, that mighty tsunami-like wave of internal energy oozing his nerves and blood vessels, almost gorging him to a bursting point. In that instant, Youku raised his eyes in panic and glimpsed the expression of this cheeky, impudent man, dark and aloof, entirely uncaring, like a true demon that slaughtered countless without the slightest ichor in demeanor. With a woman's sharp scream, a biting gust of wind swept past, bringing a few needles as thin as ox hair hurtling towards Wenbuxing. Almost reflexively, he let go of Youku and slammed a palm towards them from a distance away. The needles were knocked askew, but the force of his palm still did not disperse. Unable to dodge in time, the force of his palm strike hit the woman behind straight in the chest, sending her yang and crashing into the wall. It was only at this moment that Wenbuxing could clearly make out that the person who ambushed him was none other than Lu Qianqiao, who had unclogged her acupuncture points without anyone knowing. He was first taken aback, then, like he suddenly understood something, he called, "Asu, come quick, I witnessed some adultery." Zhou Zishu didn't know what to say to him. Turning around, he booted a persistent death seeker away, bent to pick up Lu Qianqiao, and said, clipped, "Cut the nonsense out, let's go." Wenbuxing made a sound of acknowledgement, and escaped with Zhou Zishu without protest. The two of them leapt away at great speed with Qing Gong, and after an interminable distance, long after they had already lost the low-life troublemakers on their trail, Zhou Zishu now stopped, threw the barely alive Lu Qianqiao under a tree, and sealed a few of her major acupuncture points. Wenbuxing crossed his arms, chuckling, "Great, you took her away, now your reputation as an unorthodox villain is further cemented." He thought about it, then reeked it smugly, "That's anyway, I don't have any good reputation either. You're mine, so this counts as sticking together for better or for worse." Zhou Zishu didn't even look at him, bending to examine Lu Qianqiao's condition. He took a small bottle of medicine out of his robes and stuffed a pill into her mouth without a second thought, regardless of whether it would work, and said, "Lao Wen, the mouth is meant for eating, not for talking crap. Just a fraction of force more, and you'd have killed her on the spot." Hearing that slightly annoyed, but inexplicably familiar address of Lao Wen, Wenbuxing was instantly overjoyed. As for the words that followed, he automatically assumed that they were just demonstrating his tough love. Lu Qianqiao coughed once, this light movement nearly caused her to fall apart. She glared at Zhou Zishu with angry eyes, speaking with much effort, "Why are you pretending at kindness?" Zhou Zishu ignored her words, squatting down to ask, "Let me ask you, where did you learn your skills of disguise front?" Lu Qianqiao did not expect this to be the RST question out of his mouth. She paused, then spat, and said gutsily despite being near death, "What's it got to do with you?" Hearing this, Wenbuxing said, "Miss Lu, were you changing your appearance and snatching the lapis armor all for Youku? Let me give you a word of advice, then, a woman doesn't have to be afraid of being ugly or stupid, but should be more fearful of being blind." That kind of trash, it's a disservice to you to have fallen for him. Do you know how Youku found us? Why Yebai would have chased a man in black into that alley. Who was it that misled you on purpose, making you think that the escaped man in black was Youku, so that you would strike out at Yebai? Who exposed your identity in front of everyone? He was using you as a human shield, silly. With his words, he ripped apart the maidenly troubles of this woman no longer in the prime of her youth. This was more fatal than Yebai's ugly freak had been. Had Lu Qianqiao possessed the slightest bit of energy to move, she would have crawled to her feet and bitten him dead. Zhou Zishu said, "Shut up." Receiving the order, Wenbuxing immediately shut his mouth tight, like he was wishing that he'd grown only a single lip. Staring at her face, Zhou Zishu estimated Lu Qianqiao's age, and suddenly asked, when you were little, did you meet an odd man who didn't have eyebrows, who was injured and starving to death? And you gave him food? In his Shifuqin Huaizhang's youth, he had once taken refuge in a farmhouse after being severely wounded by the enemies hunting him down. Penniless, it was all thanks to a little girl with a scarred face who had secretly brought him food that he could survive the worst of it. With nothing on him to repay her with, and feeling much pity for her upon seeing her disfigurement, Qin Huaizhang had taught her a few techniques of disguise. Yet, he had never thought that it would harm her in the future instead. Lu Qianqiao didn't say anything, but upon hearing these words, a brief look of surprise idled quickly across her face. Zhou Zishu understood, lowered his head to think, and drew a bottle of the wound ointment out of his robes. He set it in front of Lu Qianqiao and said, "Decide what's best for yourself, from now on." Then he rose and left. Elated, Wenbuxing followed after Zhou Zishu, saying, "She was plotting to do you in, yet, you were still so good to her, that's really." But he suddenly stopped speaking, because he saw Zhou Zishu fish another bottle of ointment out from his robes as he walked, rubbing its contents onto his own face. It wasn't obvious at first, but after a few more rubs, a different skin color was gradually revealed. Wenbuxing's eyes weren't even blinking, widening further as he stared. End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.